All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at Unit 10, Evolution. This is 10.1, Foundations in Evolutions. We're going to be kind of breaking this up into two sections. First, looking at this argument between spontaneous generation, biogenesis, which we'll define those terms, and then Darwin's predecessors. So today is going to be a lot of people. I think it's a lot of people. I'm not good at counting. Let's do this. All right, so first one we're going to look at is this guy named Aristotle. Aristotle lived around the 4th century BC. You don't need to know, for me anyway, you don't need to know when they lived. I just like history. And he came up with this. He didn't really come up with it. It was kind of the prevailing idea, but he's known for it. Came up with this idea called spontaneous generations, the idea that life can just spontaneously appear if the right conditions are met. And Aristotle actually had a recipe for mice. Stick some grain in a toga in the corner, and then a few weeks later, some baby mice will be in there. Shocking, right? I know. So he thought that they just kind of spontaneously happened. And this was the prevailing thought for years, like centuries. Fast forward to 1668, Francesco, maybe that's how you pronounce that, Redi. Last name's only as far as I'm concerned, but, here we go, Redi. He wanted to disprove spontaneous generation, so he kind of came up with this little experiment, which actually is a good experiment. He has some jars, and he put some meat in there and left some of them unsealed. And then, of course, the flies are the unsealed meat. Flies are going to land in, lay eggs on that meat, and maggots are going to come out of the meat, which is fly babies. And then the ones that were covered, the flies were unable to get to. And even though they could come to the meat and smell the meat, they couldn't get to the meat. They couldn't lay eggs on it. Therefore, no maggots, right? You'd think this would disprove spontaneous generation. Didn't. There's this other guy that came along later, and he was like, look, I can prove that this is real. So he put some kind of gravy or something in a jar, or in a flask. It should be scientifically accurate. In a flask. And heated it up, boiled it for a little bit, and let it sit. And you know what happened? Well, it got gross because there were little bugs in it, little bacteria and whatnot. And so then he said, look, I boiled everything out of there. I should have killed everything. And look what happened. It just appeared in there. Why is that going to work? So obviously spontaneous generation is true. This is like 1745. So this is that long ago that people thought that life could just spontaneously happen. Right? This guy comes around next, Lazzaro Spallanzani. One of my favorite words of the year, just to hear the student misspellings or mispronunciations. And so he took Needham's experiment and improved upon it. And he said, no, you actually can do this same experiment and prove spontaneous generation doesn't exist by covering the flask. Heated it up for a long time, killed everything. Lo and behold, nothing grows. Did they believe him? They didn't believe him. They didn't believe him. They wanted more proof, so they went and got it. Actually, they didn't. 100 years later plus, this man, Louis Pasteur, devised an experiment that would once for all prove that spontaneous generation is not a thing. So he made this special flask, gooseneck flask, boiled the water, or boiled the liquid in there, and then the stuff, you can see from the flask there, the stuff from the outside couldn't get in because it was curved. And but air was still able to get in, and it didn't grow. Nothing grew until you break the neck off, and then it grew just fine. So he proved that there was. Not only did he prove that life cannot come from non-life, but he also proved that there's microbes in the air. So Pasteur is credited with kind of the beginnings of the germ theory as well, which is this whole other thing. But so he came up with this idea of biogenesis, which is life comes from other life. That's a pretty important concept. Life coming from other life as opposed to just happening. So this next group we're going to look at are a group of people who are, I would call Darwin's predecessors, that they all kind of worked together, contemporaries within 100 years of one another. They didn't necessarily work in the same exact time periods, but used one another's work to kind of get this body of work going. And Darwin was able to use that in order to kind of begin his first ideas concerning natural selection. And so the first one is James Hutton. Hutton wrote a book in 1785. He was a geologist. he proposed this concept called uniformitarianism. And so Hutton looked at the different strata of the earth, the layers. The particular place where he looked was in Scotland, and noticed that the place in Scotland had been underwater at some point, right? Because of the way that the rocks were going vertical in some places and horizontal in others. And he came up with this idea called uniformitarianism, which is basically the idea that the quote from him was, "The present is the key to the past," meaning that the way things are happening now are the way things that have always been happening, right? And so if we can understand our world today, we can understand the world thousands of years ago. And Hutton was one of the first to say, not just thousands, that if all of Scotland was once underwater, this has been millions of years. And so Hutton was one of the first to propose the idea that the earth was very old, which is controversial at the time, as most people believed the earth was only a couple thousand years old. And the idea that it would be millions of years old was kind of outside the norm. Next guy, Thomas Malthus. Malthus is an economist living in London in the 18th century, early 19th century. And his thing was that he said that populations have the power to grow exponentially. In fact, he had as a quote, I'll read it: "The power of a population is indefinitely greater than the power of the earth to produce sustenance for man." And that's what this graph shows you. Population will increase exponentially, but resources don't. And so eventually there's going to become a point where there's more people than there is food to feed them. And this is going to create competition. This is going to create a struggle for existence, was the word that he used. And obviously this is something Darwin's going to borrow heavily from, right? And a lot of people would borrow heavily from in those days. And so starting to notice that perhaps the earth isn't just the utopia that it was once thought to be. So this is going to kind of be controversial as well in the day that it was presented. Next is going to be Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And so he came up with this idea that organisms have an inner drive toward perfection. That the way that organisms change over time is that they want to, right? So the giraffe goes outside, notice the trees are really tall, and thinks, you know what, one of these days I'm going to reach those trees, and just stretches its neck out, trains, the Rocky music montage turns on, and then at the end of the music, it's able to reach up and grab those leaves. Definitely not real, but this is what they kind of thought, right? That an animal based on this inner drive toward perfection could acquire certain characteristics over the course of their life. And so he came up with this idea of acquired characteristics or acquired traits. Not that we don't all acquire traits over the course of our lifetime. The difference is that he believed that they could pass those acquired traits down to the next generation. That new giraffe with a long neck could then have offspring with long necks as well. And so this is obviously not true, right? This is not something that Darwin would borrow from directly, but he would notice was competing with his own views. And he also came up with the idea of use and disuse, which is similar, right? It's if an animal uses something, it'll get better, and if they disuse it, if they can stop using it, that it would eventually just go away, like, you know, an appendix or whale legs. And next is Georges Cuvier. Cuvier is the first to say that creatures could go extinct and be left without a trace, and he was famous for, in North America, finding the mastodon, and Thomas Jefferson saying, well, there's some mastodons out there probably, and sent a couple guys to go look for them named Lewis and Clark. And that's among other things that they were doing. And then Cuvier also came up with this idea of catastrophism, which is the theory that the earth is shaped by sudden violent events as opposed to a long gradual change, right? Which is what Hutton was kind of going for with uniformitarianism. So catastrophism was the kind of the opposite of uniformitarianism. And next is Charles Lyell. We mentioned Lyell specifically because he was a contemporary of Darwin's, and he was a geologist, again, studying the earth, changes in the earth, things like weathering. He wrote a book called Principles of Geology, and also uniformitarianism guy, and watched kind of, you know, mountains eroding and watching some of the patterns on Earth, and recognized that that all mountains start off tall, right? And that these mountains over here aren't tall. Why aren't they tall? Because they've been eroded. How long does it take to erode a mountain? A long time, right? And so Lyle wrote this book, Principles of Geology, which apparently was a banger in the day. And Charles Darwin really liked it and read it on his trip. And, that was kind of the thing. That if this is happening, if change is happening on Earth, it's happening over a long period of time. And so Darwin said, you know what? If the organisms on Earth are changing, then that's probably happening over a long period of time too. Thanks, Lyle. And then Alfred Wallace is next. Wallace, interesting story with Wallace. I'd actually encourage you, if you're interested, go read more about this. He came to the theory of natural selection by studying in Malaysia, and actually sent Darwin his essay in 1858. Of course, it takes a while for mail to get from Malaysia to London. And so they were sharing these ideas back and forth. And in the meantime, Darwin published his own work called On the Origin of Species, which went on to be pretty popular. So it's not as if Darwin stole Wallace's work or anything. They had both independently come up with these ideas. But it is interesting that they did, right? That they both independently came up with these ideas that are just kind of that animals change based on selection pressure. And so Wallace is also credited with discovering natural selection, or evolution by natural selection. Doesn't quite have the name that Darwin has.